For many years, Olympus was widely respected as a Japanese technology company with strong global reach. It was known for optical precision and medical innovation, especially in endoscopy, where its products became deeply trusted by hospitals and clinicians. That reputation mattered because it created a sense of stability. Customers relied on Olympus for consistent quality, and investors often saw the company as a long-term industrial name rather than a speculative story. To understand how the accounting scandal became possible, it helps to go back to the economic environment that shaped many Japanese corporations in the late 1980s and early 1990s. During Japan's asset bubble, companies across industries held large investment portfolios. When asset values later fell, some firms were left with significant unrealized losses on securities and other financial positions. Even when these losses were not immediately realized in cash, they could still pressure a company's financial statements and future profitability. For a business that valued reputation and continuity, publicly recognizing large losses could feel like admitting failure. In many organizations, especially large and tradition-driven ones, there can be a strong preference for gradual problem solving behind the scenes. That preference is not automatically wrong. Calm, long-term thinking can be a strength, but it can become a serious risk if it turns into a belief that difficult realities should be kept out of sight until the right time. In Olympus's case, later investigations described a long-running effort to keep certain investment losses from appearing clearly in the company's reported results. The details became a major public story in 2011, but the roots reached further back. The key idea is that losses did not disappear. They were carried, shifted, and managed in ways that prevented transparent recognition. This created a gap between the company's public image, steady, high quality, dependable, and a private financial burden that needed ongoing attention. When a company tries to manage a burden quietly for years, it can drift into a pattern where the priority becomes maintain the appearance of normal performance. Over time, teams may treat that appearance as a requirement rather than a goal. Once that mindset takes hold, the organization starts to make decisions not for the best long-term economic outcome, but for the best short-term reporting outcome. That is how small compromises can turn into a system. Another factor is complexity. Olympus was not a simple single product business. It had multiple divisions and global operations, and it also engaged in investment activities. Complexity makes strong governance more important because different teams can make decisions that appear reasonable in isolation but become risky when combined. Complexity also makes oversight harder. Boards and auditors may not see every detail unless the company's internal reporting culture is unusually open and well structured. In addition, the value of trust can create a paradox. The more a company is trusted, the less people expect a serious internal problem. When stakeholders assume integrity is strong, they may not demand the same level of challenge or skepticism. Inside the company, employees may also assume that what leadership is doing must be acceptable simply because the company is prestigious and successful. all these ingredients, historic financial pressure, long-term reputation concerns, complexity, and a culture that may have avoided openly confronting uncomfortable results, formed the background. Olympus's products continued to serve real customers. The business continued operating. Yet beneath that visible success, a hidden weight remained, and keeping it hidden required ongoing choices. This is the first lesson of the Olympus story. Concealment is rarely a single decision. It is usually a long chain of decisions that become normalized over time. The longer it continues, the harder it becomes to stop, because the organization becomes afraid of what will happen if the truth arrives all at once. In the next part, we'll move to the moment when the hidden burden could no longer stay hidden. A leadership conflict, sudden questions about unusual deals, and the start of public scrutiny that changed Olympus's trajectory. In 2011, Olympus entered a period of intense attention after questions emerged about a set of corporate transactions that seemed difficult to explain in ordinary business terms. The story did not begin with a dramatic public confession. It began with people noticing that certain deals, particularly acquisitions and related advisory payments, looked unusually large compared with the size and strategic value of the businesses involved. Acquisitions are normal. Companies buy other companies for technology, market access, or growth. Advisory fees are also normal. Mergers often require legal and financial expertise. But in Olympus's case, later reporting and investigative findings pointed to fees and valuations that appeared out of proportion. When fees are exceptionally high, observers naturally ask, what exactly was purchased and what justified this price? If the strategic logic is unclear and the financial structure is complicated, it can create a strong signal that something else may be happening behind the deal. A major turning point came with a leadership dispute involving Michael Woodford, a longtime Olympus executive who became chief executive and then quickly raised concerns internally about those transactions. The situation escalated rapidly. Rather than becoming an internal debate about governance improvements, it turned into a public crisis when Woodford was removed from his role. That sequence, concerns raised followed by removal, drew immediate outside attention because it suggested the company was not welcoming scrutiny at the highest level. When a governance disagreement becomes public, the focus shifts from the details of one transaction to the integrity of decision-making. Investors and analysts begin asking broader questions. Is the board independent? Are internal controls effective? Do executives feel safe raising concerns? Is management aligned with long-term shareholder value or with protecting a private narrative? From an educational perspective, this moment illustrates how red flags often appear. They are rarely a single piece of evidence. They are patterns that don't fit. Unclear rationale, unusually high fees, complex structures, and leadership actions that appear to discourage questioning. Any one of these might be explainable. Together, they create pressure for a deeper investigation. Olympus soon formed an independent panel to review the issues. The goal of such a panel is to establish facts and evaluate whether prior accounting and disclosures were appropriate. These processes are critical because public confidence depends on independent review, not on internal reassurance. When a company faces allegations of hidden losses, it cannot rebuild trust by simply saying everything is fine. It must show how decisions were made, how they were recorded, and why oversight failed. As the investigation progressed, Olympus admitted that its past financial reporting included efforts to keep certain losses from being reported transparently. This admission changed the story from a disagreement over management to a long-running concealment problem. The public learned that the issue was not limited to one year's result, but linked to a longer period and multiple transactions. This period also shows why timing matters. The longer an organization postpones recognition of losses, the more it risks a sudden trust shock later. If losses had been recognized earlier in a straightforward way, the company might have faced near-term pain but avoided a massive credibility collapse. Concealment can feel like buying time, but it often compounds the eventual cost. Another lesson is about leadership behavior under pressure. In healthy systems, raising concerns triggers investigation and improvement. In unhealthy systems, raising concerns trigger defensive reactions. The difference is culture and governance, whether the organization treats uncomfortable questions as a threat or as essential information. In the Olympus case, 2011 became the year when a hidden burden met external light. The company's reputation, built through real product excellence, now faced questions about reporting integrity. Stakeholders began to separate two truths. Olympus could be a strong operating business while also having serious governance failures. In the next part, we'll explore what investigators concluded about the concealment practices, how the company had to revise its reporting, and why the aftermath involved not just financial restatement, but a deep rethinking of oversight and accountability. After the crisis became public, Olympus faced an urgent task: reassemble trust by reassembling facts. This is one of the most difficult phases of any accounting scandal. People often imagine that once a company admits a problem, the story is basically over. In reality, admission is only the beginning. The hardest work is determining what happened over many years, how it affected financial statements, and what must be corrected. Independent investigations concluded that Olympus had used various arrangements over time that had the effect of keeping certain investment losses from being recognized in a straightforward way. These arrangements were not simply about one accounting entry. They involved a chain of actions designed to move the impact of losses away from the core company's visible reporting. Over time, the organization treated these arrangements as a continuing solution rather than as a temporary bridge. When investigators reconstruct such a history, they look for documentation, transaction trails, counterparties, and internal communication. They also examine incentives. Who benefited from postponing the recognition of losses, and what pressures shaped decision making? The deeper the time span, the more difficult the reconstruction becomes, because people change roles, records become harder to locate, and normal practice becomes harder to separate from intentional concealment. Olympus was required to restate financial results and correct disclosures, which is a formal way of saying previous statements did not reflect the company's financial reality with sufficient accuracy. Restatements can be deeply damaging because they do not merely reduce one year's profit, they call into question the reliability of the reporting system itself. If a company's reporting system can sustain a concealment effort over years, stakeholders wonder what else the system might miss. During this period, Olympus also faced market consequences, share price volatility, investor uncertainty, and the risk of losing key relationships can quickly intensify. Even if a company's day-to-day operations continue, corporate instability can weaken its negotiating position with lenders and partners. Employees may feel anxious, and customers may watch carefully to ensure product support remains stable. One critical point for viewers is that accountability in such cases is multi-layered. It involves executives who approved or tolerated practices, finance teams who implemented them, boards that did not detect them earlier, and external gatekeepers who did not surface concerns in time. This is why the aftermath often includes leadership changes and governance reforms, not just accounting corrections. It is also why the story becomes a teaching case. It shows how failures can occur even in well-known institutions, not because they lack intelligence, but because they lack a culture and structure that consistently rewards transparency. The Olympus scandal also illustrated how acquisitions can become a vehicle for hiding financial problems when governance is weak. If a company pays inflated prices or unusually large advisory fees, those payments can be explained publicly as strategic investment costs rather than as part of a concealment pattern. This does not mean that acquisitions are suspicious by nature. It means that acquisitions require especially strong oversight because they combine valuation judgment, complex accounting treatment, and executive discretion. Another lesson is the role of independent directors and effective board challenge. A board must be able to ask questions that management cannot easily dismiss. Why is this fee so large? What alternatives were considered? How was valuation determined? Who approved the assumptions? What evidence supports them? Without that challenge, deals can become management decisions rather than governed decisions. By the time Olympus began correcting its reporting and acknowledging what had happened, the company had already paid a high trust cost. But this phase also created an opportunity. Once the story is known, the company can stop spending energy on concealment and redirect energy toward improving systems and rebuilding credibility. In the next part, we'll look at the governance and cultural reforms that followed, and why rebuilding a company's integrity is less about public statements and more about changing everyday decision-making habits. When people hear accounting scandal, they often focus on the numbers, but the deeper story is usually governance, the structures and habits that decide which information travels upward, which questions are welcomed, and how risks are handled when they threaten targets or reputation. Olympus became a powerful example of how a respected company can still develop internal blind spots when culture discourages open challenge. A key weakness in many long-running concealment cases is the closed-loop problem. A small group of decision makers controls information and frames complex transactions as necessary, technical, or urgent. If others in the organization feel discouraged from questioning leadership, especially when decisions are presented as protecting the company, then the control environment weakens. Controls do not fail only because policies are missing. They fail when people believe policies do not apply to certain decisions. In Olympus's case, the concealment of losses over time suggested not only technical manipulation, but also a cultural preference for avoiding reputational disruption. If leadership believes that acknowledging losses will harm the company's standing, it may search for alternative paths that preserve appearances. Over time, employees may internalize that protecting appearances is part of loyalty. That is a dangerous shift because it turns the organization's moral compass away from transparency and toward narrative management. Governance reforms typically aim to break the closed loop. That means strengthening board independence, adding directors who can challenge management, and ensuring audit committees have genuine authority. It also means improving internal audit, giving it the mandate and protection to investigate sensitive topics without fear of retaliation or career harm. If internal audit is treated as a formality, it cannot protect the company. If it is treated as an early warning system, it can. Another practical reform is documentation discipline. Long-running concealment often survives because key decisions are poorly documented or documented in a way that avoids clarity. Strong governance requires that major transactions, especially acquisitions, large fees, and complex financial arrangements, have clear written rationales, competing options, and defined approval processes. The goal is not bureaucracy, it is traceability. When decisions are traceable, it becomes harder for hidden motives to survive. A third reform is incentive alignment. If executives are rewarded primarily for short-term results and share price stability, they may feel pressure to keep negative information out of sight. If they are rewarded for long-term business health, robust controls, and accurate reporting, they have a reason to surface problems early. Incentives are not minor HR detail, they are powerful control mechanism. The Olympus case also highlights the importance of psychological safety in organizations. People must believe they can raise concerns calmly and professionally without being punished. When concerns are treated as disloyalty, the organization loses access to its own internal truth. The irony is that the truth does not disappear, it simply travels underground until it becomes a public shock. Cultural reform is slow because culture is reinforced daily. It changes when leaders consistently model behaviors, admitting uncertainty, welcoming questions, rewarding early warnings, and treating corrections as discipline rather than embarrassment. In a company rebuilding after a scandal, leadership must communicate a new message. Accuracy is protection, transparency is strength. Bad news shared early is more valuable than bad news discovered late. Olympus's reforms also needed to recognize that the company's operating business remained important. Customers depended on Olympus products and services, especially in healthcare technology. That meant reforms had to be practical, keep the business stable while strengthening governance. This balancing act is difficult. Too much internal disruption can weaken execution. Too little change can signal that lessons were not learned. The broader educational takeaway is that an organization can be highly capable technically and still fragile ethically if its decision-making culture is overly protective of appearances. Governance is the bridge between capability and integrity. When the bridge is weak, even a strong company can stumble. In the next part, we'll explain, without sensationalism, how concealment mechanisms can operate at a high level, why they are hard to detect early, and what specific warning signs investors and boards can watch for in complex organizations. A long-running concealment story like Olympus is difficult to understand because it doesn't behave like a simple error. It behaves like an ongoing strategy. A company carries a financial burden and repeatedly chooses pathways that delay clear recognition. This is not described here to teach anyone how to repeat it, but to help viewers recognize why detection can be difficult and why strong skepticism is healthy in complex reporting environments. At a high level, concealment often relies on three conditions. First, complex assets and estimates. When a company holds investment assets whose values fluctuate, it can be tempting to avoid realizing losses. The company may hope values will recover, but if recovery doesn't arrive, the pressure grows. In such situations, the line between patient long-term management and avoidance of recognition can become blurred unless governance is strong. Second, transactions that look plausible on the surface. Corporate transactions often have legitimate strategic explanations. That makes them useful as camouflage when governance is weak. If a company purchases businesses that are small or unclear in strategic impact, or pays unusually large professional fees, those choices can be described as growth investment, even when they raise questions. Third, information bottlenecks. If only a small group understands the full picture, others may not challenge decisions effectively. Complexity can become a shield. People assume what they don't understand must be correct, especially if it comes from senior leadership. These conditions create warning signs that boards and investors can watch for, especially in companies that combine operating excellence with complicated financial activity. Unusually large advisory fees or transaction costs that do not match the size of the deal's apparent strategic value. A pattern of acquisitions with unclear logic, especially when they occur during periods of financial pressure. Complex explanations that resist simplification. Healthy decisions can usually be explained clearly: what was bought, why it matters, what success looks like, and what risks exist. frequent leadership tension around questioning. When those who raise concerns are isolated or pushed aside, it signals a culture problem. Delayed or inconsistent disclosure. When reporting timelines slip or explanations change repeatedly, it can indicate deeper issues. Another educational point is the limit of brand trust. Olympus's operating reputation was real. Its products delivered value. But trust in products does not automatically guarantee trust in reporting. These are different systems. Product trust is built through engineering and customer experience. Reporting trust is built through governance, internal controls, and ethical leadership. A company can be strong in one and weak in the other. It also helps to understand why early correction is so powerful. If a company recognizes losses promptly, it experiences immediate pain but reduces the risk of a long-term credibility collapse. If it delays recognition, it may appear stable for a while, but it increases the chance that the eventual correction will arrive as a major trust event. In public markets, that trust event can become more damaging than the losses themselves. For auditors and oversight bodies, a key lesson is the importance of challenging management judgments where estimates and complex transactions intersect. Skepticism is not hostility, it is a professional discipline, testing assumptions, asking for evidence, and validating whether decisions align with economic reality. Olympus's story shows why skepticism should be welcomed internally as well. A healthy company treats skeptical questions as protection. It does not treat them as a threat to authority. When skepticism is present at the right places, finance, audit, board committees, it reduces the chance that a concealed burden becomes a public crisis. In the final part, we'll follow Olympus's path after the scandal, how it worked to stabilize itself, the long-term lessons for corporate governance, and what this case continues to teach us about transparency, leadership responsibility, and sustainable trust. After the Olympus accounting scandal became public, the company faced a long, careful process of rebuilding. This phase matters because it shows how a company can move from crisis to repair without relying on dramatic gestures. Rebuilding credibility is not a single event. It is a sequence of actions that prove over time that the organization has changed how it thinks and how it governs. First, Olympus had to correct the record. That meant acknowledging the concealment, revising reporting where necessary, and cooperating with the processes that follow a public trust breakdown. This step is foundational because it signals a change from protecting appearances to prioritizing accuracy. Without corrected information, no other reform is credible. Second, the company needed governance reform. A scandal of this nature raises basic questions. Who knew what and when? Why didn't checks work? How can the board prevent a small group from controlling information? Strengthening independent oversight, improving audit committee effectiveness, and empowering internal audit are common responses because they directly address the closed-loop problem that allows concealment to persist. Third, Olympus needed cultural repair. Culture is not rebuilt with slogans. It is rebuilt when employees see that speaking up is safe, that questions are welcomed, and that leadership rewards honesty even when it complicates short-term results. A company that has lived through a concealment crisis must actively reverse the internal habit of silence. That requires consistent leadership behavior, acknowledging uncertainty, requesting early warnings, and treating corrections as discipline rather than embarrassment. Fourth, the company had to protect operational continuity. Olympus served customers who depended on reliable products and service. The business could not pause while governance improved. This created an important management challenge: stabilize internal systems without undermining execution. The best reforms are those that strengthen controls while supporting operational clarity, clearer approval paths, clearer documentation, and more reliable performance measurement. For viewers, the lasting lessons are practical and widely applicable. Lesson 1: Transparency is a form of resilience. When a company tells the truth early, it preserves its ability to adapt. Concealment reduces flexibility because it forces the organization to defend a story instead of solving a problem. Lesson 2: Governance must be designed for uncomfortable information. Boards and committees must be built to receive bad news quickly, not slowly. They must reward the delivery of reality, not the delivery of comfort. Lesson 3: Complexity requires extra discipline. When transactions and estimates become complex, the organization must increase documentation, independent review, and skepticism. Complexity should trigger stronger controls, not weaker ones. Lesson 4: Reputation can't substitute for controls. A trusted brand can still have serious internal weaknesses. Product excellence and reporting integrity must both be maintained intentionally. Olympus's story remains a powerful educational case because it shows two truths at once. A company can create real value in the world and still make choices that damage trust when it prioritizes appearances over accuracy. The goal of studying this case is not to judge from a distance, but to learn how strong systems, governance, incentives, and culture protect organizations and the people who rely on them.